Well, thanks so much for inviting me to this incredibly important conversation. And following the improvisational structure that Jesse, Mary Jo, and Jason, a triumvirate brought to us by the letter J, have suggested, I want to lay down one theme unpacked in 8 quick bars with some reference to some other performers in the ensemble. That worked? That worked. 15 years ago, my book with Steve Ballmer Prediger, Beyond Homelessness, Christian Faith in a Culture of Displacement, was published with input from a number of people in this room and more widely within the world of homeless ministries in Toronto. About a year ago, to our surprise, our publisher approached us with the suggestion that we prepare a 15th anniversary edition that updates the book by means of the addition of a significant postscript. This is the cover of the book, which will be out in September. So to help me brainstorm on the shape of what that postscript should look like, I spent 2 days last August in some fantastic conversations with Jake Aikenhead from the Gateway, Aaron Oxford from the Dale, Rachel Tulloch from Sanctuary. Where's Rachel? Oh, you're over there. Off getting a drink. Okay, good. And Phyllis Novak from Sketch. 2 days of conversation. I wanted to talk to Dion too, but he was gallivanting somewhere. Couldn't get him. 2 days of conversation, and I was off to the races. It's amazing what good conversation with good friends can spark in one's imagination. In the last chapter of our book, we told the story of Phyllis Novak and the Sketch program in the arts with at-risk and street-involved youth. Sketch has continued to grow into a significant arts organization in Toronto, still animated by the original vision of facilitating imagination for social change. In my conversation with Phyllis, I was especially interested in talking about a group installation project that Sketch had curated called Reconstructions of Home. Oh, replied Phyllis, do you remember Big Sue and Little Sue back when we were doing street youth ministry at Evergreen in the 90s? I confess that while I remembered the names, I wasn't sure that I had much to do with these youth. Well, Little Sue is Sue Cohen, and Big Sue is now Emmett Reed, and Sue is curated the show, Reconstructions of Home, and M is one of the artists. Street kids from the Evergreen Drop-In Center that I spent time with in the 90s are now cultural leaders in Toronto. How cool is that? It is precisely this incurable longing for home and remarkable resiliency of those who experience homelessness that is the focus, or was the focus, of the Reconstructions of Home project. Installed along the Bentway, an urban path running underneath the Gardiner Expressway, this site was once a home to a large encampment of folk without permanent housing. Like many encampments throughout the years, and increasingly throughout North America in the early 2020s, this community was violently removed from under the expressway by the authorities to make room for an urban park for the new condo dwellers that were moving into this area of urban renewal. Reconstructions of Home bore witness to the way in which the inhabitants of that encampment created community, safety, friendship, and family together, even as their very existence was criminalized by politicians and the police. Now, there is no cheap sentimentality or naive romanticizing about the hardships of homeless life in this art installation, but there is an insistence that home was nonetheless created in that community. A homefulness was created under that expressway that was an alternative to the homelessness that these young people felt was imposed upon them by dysfunctional families, failed education systems, gender stereotypes, homophobia, transphobia, empty consumerism, and fundamental rejection and abandonment. In Emmett's piece, Breathing Life into Our Ghosts, we meet an avatar telling their story. They talk about how they were formed, lifted, and unconditionally loved precisely in this community of unhoused folks under that expressway. In what amounts to a resurrection story, the piece concludes with this remarkable testimony. I am made of sunshine and dirt, and the darkness of the street is the brightest light I had ever seen. The brightness of the street, the darkness of the street is the brightest light I had ever seen. While the conventional notions of home had failed Emmett, there was still home to be found, home to be reconstructed amongst a community of folks who had also experienced the failure of home on so many levels in their lives. So it's not surprising that M loves to talk about homefulness. If it is true that a house does not make a home, and that all kinds of homes are themselves the sites of profound home breaking, then it is also the case that houselessness, that is, living without secure shelter, does not necessarily mean that one is totally devoid of home. Just ask the nomads at the Dale. Anyone who has ever had anything to do with folks who suffer from houselessness can bear witness to the profound capacity of homemaking in these communities. Just read Greg Paul's 20-piece shuffle. On one level, it is clear enough. The solution to homelessness is not simply housing. The extremely high rates of recidivism amongst the chronically homeless demonstrates that the move from the streets or from the shelter system into secure housing of some sort is often short-lived, a theme that was very important in Dion's ministry towards before his retirement. While giving up life on the street for secure shelter would always appear to be a good thing, the fact is that being housed is not the same thing as finding home. One can often find a deeper sense of home in a squat under a bridge with a group of people facing similar conditions than one does living alone in a secure bachelor apartment. Indeed, at their best, even emergency shelters provide more than a bed and a meal by becoming places of belonging, friendship, affiliation, and identity. Not surprisingly, folks often will prefer the sense of community in a lovingly run homeless shelter over the loneliness of a unit miles away from what has become their core community. So while the solution to houselessness is housing, the crisis of homelessness requires something fuller and deeper than shelter. I think that we've known for a very long time that housing alone is insufficient to exit homelessness. So perhaps we need to go beyond housing to homefulness. But maybe that sounds like what we might describe as a housing first plus model. First, we must acquire sufficient housing stock to meet the need, and then, once folks are housed, we need to create the conditions for homemaking within that housing. Sounds reasonable, but what would those conditions for homemaking be? How do we understand and provide for homemaking? Well, it seems to me that the more deeply that one grasps the distinction between house and home, the more important it is to discern the meaning of home. Without such discernment, the struggle to end homelessness, and indeed the project of finding home in the city, remains limited to the crucial but ultimately insufficient provision of shelter. Furthermore, and the deeper and more suggestive the understanding of home, the greater scope we will have to understand homelessness from socioeconomic, cultural, ecological, spiritual, and theological perspectives. And for that, I suggest that we need a phenomenology of home. And so for a moment, I'd like to return to the phenomenology that Balma Prediger and I developed in Beyond Homelessness. There are folks in this room who have been in class with me where we've done a word association exercise over the years. And it goes, I say home, you say what? And people just start shooting stuff up, and I'm just writing it on the board. And invariably, whenever I've done this, in each group, and each time we've done this exercise, a picture begins to emerge. And perhaps it's, at first, it's perhaps a tad romanticized, but before long, a more complex and ambivalent understanding of home unfolds. This opens the door to then talking about, well, if that's home, what's homelessness? And what does it mean to be displaced if home is to be placed? What are the various ways in which people experience homelessness, the sense of exile, dislocation, or alienation? And that leads into the next step in our understanding of home. If homelessness has something to do with not having a secured sense of one's own place in the world, which is distinct from and safe within all other places, then there needs to be some sort of boundaries that demarcate what, where, and with whom one experiences home. Boundaries, a central issue also when we're talking about hospitality. Boundaries, we discover, are constitutive to home, and yet they need to be porous, open to hospitality, not the fortress walls of xenophobic isolation. So then, on the basis of this kind of on-the-ground, lived observation, together with reflecting on various kinds of displacement and the necessity of and ambiguity of boundaries, we proposed a phenomenology of home. We made no claim to have comprehended the meaning of home with any kind of finality or even decisive and rigorous proof. Rather, phenomenology we describe as a disciplined, descriptive proposal for intuitive recognition. So we offered this proposal for intuitive recognition. It isn't so much a matter of revealing something brand new that no one has ever thought of before, as it is being attentive to real life in such a way that the description simply rings true. One offers a description of something in everyday life, and folks look at it and say, yeah, that's the way it is. Maybe that's also why poets and songwriters and rap artists are often better phenomenologists than philosophers. That's what an artist does. Artists look closely and find words, and if it's true, it just rings true. You don't have to analyze it. We discerned 8 characteristics of home. Home, we suggested, was a place of permanence. While permanence does not necessarily mean never moving, it still seems to us that a sense of enduring presence in a place, perhaps a connection to the culture and land of that place, is integral to the experience of home. As I've noted, a house is not a home. One can shelter in a house, but we dwell in our homes. Homes are sites of deep meaning, profound resonance. And that kind of dwelling, that kind of meaning making is rooted in the storied character of home. We wrote, a house becomes a home when it is transformed by memory-shaped meaning into a place of identity, connectedness, order, and care. With such a secure place of storied dwelling, home is meant to be a safe resting place. But safety does not constitute home apart from hospitality. As our sister Rachel Tulloch wisely notes, that hospitality requires attentiveness, grace, receptivity, and transformation. So again, the boundaries of home need to be porous. Homes have doors that designate in and out, but those doors that hospitality opens. Those doors are opened by hospitality, so that home becomes a site of welcome, celebration, and protection to others. And I do think it was Levinas who said that a home has a door, but has to be open, has to have the ability to open. A homeland preoccupied with establishing walls to keep the neighbor, and especially the neighbor in need, out, is no home at all. Further, akin to our emphasis on dwelling, we suggested that home is a place of embodied inhabitation. The emphasis here was more on the embodiment of our dwelling, bringing attention to the organic intimacy that is entailed in the relationship of home to a particular place. We not only shape a place into home, but that place, that landscape, geology, watershed, biotic community, also shapes the way in which we can be at home there. In other words, human inhabitation must be shaped by ecological habitat. And to the degree that we are rooted in our home place, normatively shaped and formed within the context of home, It follows that home is a place of orientation, the place from which we get our bearings. No wonder that being exiled from home, experiencing deep homelessness or even homesickness is so profoundly disorienting. And finally, home is a foundational place of belonging. It is in the bonds of love that we are held. It is in knowing who we are and to whom we belong and where we come from that we receive our deepest identity. That's why I shared what I shared at the beginning. My father was an asshole. There could be no home with my father, no home at all. And that's why coming to meet Jesus at Young Street Mission when I was 16 years old was such a profound homecoming, because there I found a community which gave me a place of permanence. They weren't leaving, a place of dwelling. I could live with these folks. They gave me a whole brand new story, an incredibly rich story of the gospel that became my story. And then even the story of Young Street Mission became my story. You know, it was a place of safety. It was a place where I was immediately welcomed in, of hospitality. The sense of embodied habitation, for me, that was the connection with the Christian Community Center. That was the connection with Regent Park. You know, it's hard to be embodied at 381 Yonge Street, because what the heck was 381 Yonge Street? But in Regent Park, you could be embodied. There's real structures there that you had to deal with. I received the fundamental orientation for my life, and I knew that I belonged. I knew that I had a place in the body of Christ. So 8 characteristics of home. A sort of rough and ready, though seriously thought out phenomenology of home. So when our lives have no sense of permanence, but are thrown into chaos or constantly on the move, either climbing the corporate ladder or in transit as economic, climate, and war refugees, home is threatened. If we simply live in a place without a sense of abiding dwelling, home is diminished. If stories of home are ones of violence, abuse, and rejection, then home is broken, and one can function neither as a safe resting place nor as a point of orientation in our lives. Homes close in on themselves without a sense of welcome and hospitality are constricted and incomplete. When we are divorced from a deep sense of inhabiting, respecting, and loving our places, we find ourselves not at home with our habitats, but rather prone to ecological domicide. And of course, it all comes down to belonging and love. A house, a family, a society in which one has a debilitating experience of not belonging cannot be home. Just ask the disproportionate number of African American, African Canadian, Indigenous, LGBTQ plus folks amongst the ranks of the homeless in Canada and the United States. If you don't belong, you don't belong. So in light of how crucial a phenomenology of home is, for both imagining what home can and should look like in its various dimensions, and for discerning the various forms of homelessness, I'm rather encouraged to note that over the last 15 years, numerous other authors and organizations have found it necessary to identify at least some parameters around the notion of home. Again, some sort of implicit and sometimes explicit phenomenology of homes needs to be foundational for insightful analysis and any proposals for addressing homelessness. Here are some notable examples really quickly. In Longing for Home, M. Jan Holton describes home as the prime site of meaning in human life, nourishing a sense of security within a web of relationships in which we experience a life-enhancing belonging. In The Home of God, Miroslav Volf and Ryan McAnally Lintz argue that home is a place of resonance, where there's a sense of being deeply affected by this place and these people, attachment, in which abiding bonds are forged and a shared vision of life is nourished, belonging again, where one is a vital member, and one experiences a deep mutuality within a complex web of relationships. Or consider Kevin Nye's engaging book, Grace Can Lead Us Home, A Christian Call to End Homelessness, in which home is described in terms of safety, belonging, dignity, and hope. And perhaps most instructive and helpful is the recently released Church of England report, Coming Home, Tackling the Housing Crisis Together. This wide-ranging and comprehensive report makes proposals for the church to address the homelessness crisis on the basis of 5 values that are at the heart of deep homemaking. This is, if you will, a functional phenomenology of home. They argue that if you're to develop housing for homemaking that engenders deep community development, then that housing needs to be sustainable, in harmony with the natural world, safe, secure from intrusion and violence, stable, with secure tenure and affordability so people can put down roots in that place, sociable, places of hospitality and community, and satisfying, places of delight and beauty. And out of this model, the Commission identifies an action plan for the church and the nation to address the ongoing crisis of homelessness in England in a way that goes beyond the warehousing of the poor in ugly, unsafe, precarious, and unsustainable estates. I'm especially impressed with the biblical and theological depth of their work. I find all of this encouraging, and so I would suggest that the more profound the phenomenology, the deeper the analysis that emerges, and the more creative the proposals that are offered. I really think we need to think through what are we talking about when we talk about home. And one way to bring all of this together would be to say that what we're all getting at here, we might describe as homefulness. Michael Shapcott, whose name a number of you would know in the housing and homeless world, has on a number of occasions credited Walsh and Baumer-Prediger for this notion of homefulness. It never appeared in our book. I first get it from Phyllis Novak. That's the first person I heard talk about homefulness. So while not a term employed in the first edition of Beyond Homelessness, we find it helpful to describe the various degrees of home experienced, we find it helpful to describe the various degrees of home experienced in different contexts. The more characteristics of home being experienced, the more profound is the reality of homefulness. In a University of Toronto dissertation, which was an ethnographic study of the Gateway Shelter, Amy Fisher wrote about homefulness as both a gauge to describe levels of homelessness and to promote better emergency shelters. One experiences home when the warmth of the space is more than a temperature on the thermostat. Home is a place of shared meals, life-giving habits and routines, familiarity, stability, unproductive time, memory, and story. All things that she found at the Gateway. Just aside, we used to host Angie and the leadership team from the Common Table for a day retreat at our farm. It's basically come up, do what you got to do, and I'm going to feed the crap out of you. I'm going to put on a meal that you're going to remember. And I'm working in the kitchen once, and they're having and then I would facilitate some time for us to reflect together. And they're having a conversation about the common table. And I'm cooking in the kitchen there, and the conversation is going along these lines. Well, I really think that we need to paint the walls because I think that this color just doesn't really create the ambience that we're looking for here. And then somebody says, and you know where the toasters are located? That's not working right now because the lineups get all messed up. And they're talking all this daily kind of nitty-gritty stuff. And I'm thinking, they're talking about how to make this place home. We all know it's not home. We all know it's a food ministry in the basement of the Church of Redeemer, but they're talking about how do we create a sense of homefulness here. One experiences home when the warmth of the space is more than the temperature on the thermostat. Fisher writes, homeful must undoubtedly mean enmeshment with other people in communities both larger and smaller than the coveted nuclear family. In the best possible scenario, it would also signal enmeshment with the earth that grounds and sustains it. So insofar as a shelter system, or for that matter, any kind of housing provision or community development doesn't engender such an experience and practice of homefulness, it fails in its calling to homemaking in the face of the profound homelessness of our time. It provides shelter and even housing, probably food, but not home. So what happens, now I'm coming to my question, what happens if we begin to discern that not only is housing a human right, not only is housing a human right, but more foundationally, all humans have a right to home. While a roof over your head, basic food security, and safety are, of course, crucial, the right to housing needs to be rooted more deeply in the human longing for home. If home does indeed have something of the characteristics that we and others have described, then don't we need to go beyond housing to homefulness? Or perhaps what we are really talking about is homefulness before housing. Isn't that where taking seriously the lived homemaking of those who are houseless leads us? In the reconstructions of home installation, in every refugee camp, homeless encampment, and community of precarious shelter, we meet folks making home together. We meet various degrees of homefulness. So perhaps the question isn't really how we address degrees of homefulness to housing, but how homefulness is at the foundation of any housing that has a chance of fostering homemaking. So, if we're seeking to find home in the city, and if hospitality is at the heart of such home finding, then what do we mean by home? And is homefulness a helpful and suggestive enough theme to improvise on? Thanks very much, folks.